The night was heavy with storm clouds, and thunder cracked over the stone fortress. Thomas gripped his trembling hands as the order echoed, "Execute him now." His chest tightened with dread, yet soldiers' eyes burned into his back. Edward whispered with false comfort, "Do it for the crown." Thomas's heart raced as the prisoner, bound and bruised, stared with quiet defiance. William peeked from a shadowed arch, his breath caught in fear. A torch sputtered, throwing jagged shadows against wet walls. Soldiers shifted uneasily, their armor creaking like mournful bells. Thomas raised the blade, but guilt slashed deeper than steel. Edward's smirk betrayed secret satisfaction. Lightning revealed Richard watching from the gallery above, his cloak flowing like a dark omen. History turned on this moment, and Thomas felt it. Thomas stood frozen, sword trembling, his mind fractured between duty and guilt. He thought of his mother's words, "Never harm the innocent," yet Edward's voice was sharp in his ear. "Do it, or you will be branded a coward." The prisoner's eyes pierced him, not pleading but condemning. William clutched the arch tighter, his breath ragged, heart pounding. Richard remained silent above, the weight of his gaze crushing Thomas. A soldier muttered, "This isn't right." The storm raged louder, drowning hesitation with fury. Thomas whispered, "If I do this, I am no better than them." His voice cracked, yet none heard. Shadows deepened across the courtyard, each second stretching like a lifetime. Edward stepped closer, whispering with urgency, "This is your test, Thomas." His smirk widened as he grasped Thomas's arm. Thomas recoiled, snarling, "You think I serve the crown, but I serve my soul." Edward's jaw tightened, masking anger with feigned calm. Richard, high above, narrowed his eyes, lips curving in approval of Edward's manipulation. William's eyes widened, realizing Edward's words were poison. The prisoner laughed bitterly, coughing blood, and said, "History will not forgive your silence." The courtyard grew colder, torches sputtering as storm beat harder. Soldiers leaned forward, breaths sharp, their faith in command wavering. William gasped as the prisoner's words cut through the storm. His heart pounded in his ears as he thought, "They will kill us all if truth escapes." He turned to flee but froze when Richard's gaze fell on him from above. The opportunist's lips curled slightly, signaling he had seen too much. Thomas lowered his blade slightly, chest heaving, torn between orders and morality. Edward leaned in, whispering again, "Strike now before he corrupts you." The prisoner spat blood, muttering, "Only the guilty silence the weak." Soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, their loyalty fractured by doubt. The fortress walls groaned under the weight of storm and history alike. The storm reached its height as Thomas dropped his sword into the mud with a metallic thud. Silence fell heavier than thunder, every eye turning toward him. Edward's face twisted with fury, his facade breaking. "You fool," he hissed, teeth clenched. Richard stepped forward in the gallery, voice booming, "Then history will remember your weakness." Soldiers gasped, unsure of their allegiance. The prisoner closed his eyes, whispering, "Perhaps mercy lives yet." William's knees buckled, relief and terror clashing inside him. Thomas stood tall, drenched and shaking, yet, for the first time, unyielding. In that storm-lit courtyard, the first fracture of betrayal had begun. The storm faded into a chilling silence as dawn broke across the fortress. Thomas sat alone, his sword still caked with mud, eyes hollow and trembling with doubt. He whispered, "What have I done?" though no one answered. Memories of his mother's words haunted him, her gentle voice clashing with Edward's venom. William hid in a corner, hugging his knees, terrified by what he had seen. The prisoner's silence echoed louder than any scream. Edward entered with deliberate steps, smirk sharpened into a blade, saying, "History rewards the bold, not the weak." Thomas clenched his fists, shame burning. Richard watched from afar, plotting the cracks of loyalty like a hunter stalking prey. The courtyard's torches were extinguished, but shadows clung thicker than ever. Edward approached Thomas with practiced calm, his words cutting through the heavy air. You hesitate again, and you will be the one condemned, he said coldly. Thomas's jaw tightened, his fists trembling at his sides. William, pale and silent, tried to retreat unnoticed, but stumbled against loose stone. Richard's eyes from above caught the boy's movement, calculating every weakness. Do not run, boy, Richard's voice carried like a judge's verdict. William froze, breath ragged, fear etched across his young face. The prisoner coughed, his laughter bitter, whispering, "Even children see your corruption." Soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty caught between fear and conscience. Thomas's heart raced, knowing his silence condemned them all. The council chamber echoed with the sound of dripping water from storm-soaked rafters. Richard sat at the head, his cloak draped in authority, voice calm yet venomous. "The kingdom needs strength, not hesitation," he declared. Edward nodded eagerly, eyes darting toward Thomas, who stood silently at the edge. Thomas thought of the prisoner's defiance and of William's terror, his stomach twisting with guilt. "Silence speaks guilt," Richard said, his gaze piercing Thomas. William whispered to himself, "Why must he suffer for their greed?" The chamber guards remained still, their hands tight on spears, faces masked with unease. The storm outside had ceased, but thunder now rumbled in the hearts within. Night returned as William carried a folded parchment through empty corridors. His hands shook, ink smearing onto his skin, the letter's weight pressing like iron. The shadow of Richard's gaze haunted his every step. Thomas intercepted him at the corner, whispering, "What do you carry, boy?" William hesitated, eyes wide, then whispered back, "Proof of betrayal." Thomas's blood chilled, suspicion flashing toward Edward's scheming presence nearby. Edward appeared suddenly, voice smooth as silk. "Secrets belong to the strong, not the scared." William clutched the parchment tighter, fear and courage warring in his young heart. Torches hissed in the damp air as footsteps echoed behind them, signaling the walls themselves were listening. The drums of war thundered across the hills as dawn bled red upon the horizon. Thomas stood atop the ramparts, his breath sharp with dread. "The storm was only the beginning," he muttered. Below, soldiers prepared with shaking hands, tightening leather straps and sharpening steel. Edward moved among them, words of venom disguised as encouragement, promising victory while planting seeds of betrayal. Richard's banners unfurled, black against the crimson sky, his ambition cloaked as duty. William watched from the battlements, tears streaking his dirt-stained face, whispering, "This is not strength, this is ruin." The prisoner, still chained, raised his head toward the rising sun, whispering, "Let history bear witness." The weight of choices pressed down heavier than armor. The council chamber buzzed with unease as Richard addressed the nobles with practiced poise. "Strength must rule, or we all fall," he declared, his voice slicing through the stale air. Edward nodded eagerly, whispering promises to sway hesitant men. Thomas lingered at the edge, silent, his conscience heavy, his eyes fixed on the floor. William stood near the doorway, his youth unfit for such venom, listening with dread. One noble muttered, "War will bleed us dry," but Richard's glare silenced him. The prisoner's chains clattered from below, his faint voice echoing, "Strength without justice is nothing." The chamber chilled as truth and ambition collided, and Thomas clenched his fists, caught between silence and defiance. In the courtyard shadows, the mysterious shadow figure observed unseen. His hood obscured most of his face, eyes glinting with calculated intent. Thomas walked nearby, unaware of the gaze upon him, lost in thoughts of failure and guilt. Edward emerged from the barracks, speaking to soldiers with feigned warmth, twisting loyalty into chains. Richard's voice carried from the balcony above, commanding obedience, his authority pressing like a storm. William spotted the hooded figure and gasped softly, unsure if he saw protector or predator. The prisoner groaned from his cell, his words broken yet sharp, eyes in the dark see truer than kings. The fortress seemed alive with secrets, every stone whispering treachery. The barracks were restless with whispers of doubt as Thomas confronted Edward directly. "You poison their minds with lies," Thomas said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. Edward's smirk grew sharper, his tone dripping with contempt. "I guide them where you falter." Soldiers turned their heads, listening, unease carving lines across their faces. William slipped inside, wide-eyed, watching two men he once trusted teeter on the brink. The prisoner's cough echoed faintly from outside, like an omen of decay. Richard appeared at the doorway, his presence enough to silence murmurs, his cold voice saying, "Loyalty is measured by strength, not sentiment." Thomas felt every eye pierce him, the weight of betrayal pressing harder. Market stalls lay abandoned under gray skies, wooden carts overturned, fruits rotting in the mud. Thomas walked through in silence, footsteps heavy with regret. Children's laughter that once filled the square had been replaced by whispers behind shuttered windows. William followed timidly, eyes wide, asking, "Will it ever be safe again?" Thomas could not answer, his silence louder than words. Edward appeared at the far end, speaking to townsfolk with false promises, his charm hiding venom. Richard's banners hung high above the square, black fabric fluttering like storm clouds made cloth. The prisoner's voice echoed faintly from the keep, reminding all that captivity was the kingdom's truest reflection. The fortress halls rang with the hammering of steel, as preparations for war intensified. Thomas sharpened his blade, his reflection fractured in its surface, his doubts etched into every scar. William stood beside him, hesitant, whispering, "You can still choose mercy." Thomas's silence was heavy, his breath uneven. Edward rallied soldiers nearby, his voice fierce, "Victory is our birthright." Richard strode past, his gaze fixed forward, banners trailing like shadows behind him. The prisoner's chains rattled through the stone corridors, his defiance alive despite captivity. The shadow figure lingered above, watching all unfold with enigmatic stillness. The air thickened with dread, as if history itself held its breath. The ambush came beneath a swollen moon, silver light spilling over shattered fields. Thomas moved with unease, his sword gripped tight, though his heart resisted the fight. From the tree line, shadows erupted, armored men clashing with startled soldiers. Edward cried, "Hold your ground," his voice sharp as steel. William cowered behind broken carts, hands pressed to his ears, whispering, "Make it stop." Richard stood tall upon a hill, his cloak billowing like dark wings, directing the chaos with cold precision. The prisoner, dragged in chains, stumbled among the carnage, his voice hoarse yet defiant. "Your war devours its children," he said. Arrows hissed, torches flickered, and betrayal echoed louder than the clash of steel. In the aftermath of battle, Thomas sat among the fallen, his blade stained with both mud and regret. He whispered, "I killed not enemies but brothers." William knelt beside him trembling, saying, "It is not your fault." Edward arrived, his smirk thin as he said, "Weakness speaks through guilt." Thomas's fists clenched, his breath ragged, his heart heavy. Richard watched from a distance, his eyes calculating, every loss twisted into opportunity. The prisoner raised his head despite his wounds, saying, "You bleed for their lies." Torches flickered across corpses, shadows stretching like accusations. The fortress loomed in silence, walls drinking in the echoes of pain. Edward approached Thomas in the war tent, shadows flickering across canvas walls. "You falter again and the kingdom will fall," Edward said sharply. Thomas glared, his voice cracking, "I cannot kill my conscience." Richard entered with silent authority, his presence filling the space. He declared, "The crown demands obedience, not questions." William lingered at the entrance, fists clenched, fear warring with defiance. The prisoner's groans carried faintly from outside, his suffering a reminder of their corruption. Thomas's chest heaved, torn between loyalty and morality. Edward smirked, whispering, "Your hesitation feeds their doubt." The air thickened with lies and half-truths, choking hope from the room. The fortress bells tolled as William staggered into the courtyard, clutching torn parchment stained with dirt. He shouted, "I saw the truth, Edward is the betrayer." His voice cracked, yet courage steadied his trembling form. Edward's face paled, then twisted into venom, his words sharp. "You know nothing, boy." Thomas stepped forward, eyes wide, betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. Richard raised his hand for silence, his calculating stare shifting to Edward. The prisoner shouted from behind bars, "At last, the mask falls." Soldiers murmured uneasily, loyalty swaying with the weight of truth. Torches flared brighter, flames painting the courtyard with judgment. A storm broke as Richard confronted Edward before the gathered soldiers. "Loyalty is not yours to twist," Richard declared, his voice thunderous. Edward sneered, shouting, "Without me, this kingdom rots." Thomas stood between them, torn, whispering, "Enough, both of you." William watched from the shadows, praying silently for salvation. The prisoner shouted through rain, "Betrayal will eat you alive." Lightning illuminated every strained face, truth burning brighter than fire. Soldiers gripped weapons, uncertain who to follow, fear mingling with rage. The fortress shuddered under storm and discord, the air thick with the promise of collapse. In that moment, trust shattered like glass. The courtyard erupted with tension as Edward's secret was finally unmasked. Thomas stood rigid, his chest heaving, whispering, "So, it was you all along." Edward's smirk faltered, before twisting into defiance. "I chose survival," he spat, voice trembling with rage. William clutched the parchment tightly, his voice breaking. "You betrayed us all." Richard stepped forward, eyes gleaming, calculating how to use the truth as a weapon. Soldiers murmured, shifting loyalties hanging in fragile balance. The prisoner gripped his bars, shouting, "Betrayers always drown in their own lies." Torches hissed in the storm wind, sparks scattering into the night as the kingdom's fate trembled on the edge of a blade. The silence broke when Richard's voice cut through like a blade. "The boy speaks truth," he declared, his tone steady yet cruel. Edward turned on him, snarling, "You used me and now you cast me aside." Thomas stepped forward, fury burning, "You poisoned every oath." William trembled, clutching the parchment as proof of deceit. The prisoner laughed bitterly, shouting, "Betrayers and tyrants drink from the same poisoned cup." Edward's mask cracked, desperation flickering in his eyes. The soldiers gripped their weapons, unsure whether to bow to fear or fight for honor. Rain pounded harder, lightning revealing the fracture of trust that would change history forever. The chains of secrecy shattered as William's voice rang out. "The prisoner is heir to the throne." Gasps echoed, torches wavered, and the world seemed to tilt. Thomas staggered back, whispering, "All this blood, for a crown stolen." Edward's fury twisted to dread, his face pale, words caught in his throat. Richard's eyes narrowed, silence masking calculations of power. The prisoner raised his head, eyes burning with truth. "I endured chains to reveal justice." William's body trembled, but his voice remained steady. "We must stand with him." Courtyard swelled with whispers, soldiers uncertain, history splitting open like thunder's crack. The shadow figure emerged from the darkness, cloak dripping with rain, voice calm but commanding. "The true heir cannot die tonight." Thomas's chest tightened, realizing the truth had been hidden in silence. Edward stepped back, eyes wild, shouting, "You think shadows can save him?" Richard's lips curled slightly, calculating every move. William looked to Thomas, whispering, "We cannot let Edward win." The prisoner lifted his chains, his voice steady. "Justice is not granted by kings but carved by sacrifice." Torches flared violently, as if history itself demanded light. Soldiers' breaths quickened, steel quivered, the storm roaring like the kingdom's soul. The storm raged as betrayal and truth collided in thunder. Edward shouted, "Without me, the kingdom falls," his voice desperate and cracking. Richard's voice boomed above the storm, "History crowns not betrayers but victors." Thomas raised his sword, trembling yet resolute, whispering, "No more lies." William clutched the parchment, whispering a prayer through clenched teeth. The prisoner lifted his chains high, his voice cutting the storm. Chains break when courage rises. Soldiers' cries split the night, torn between shadows and honor. Lightning struck the ramparts, sparks showering the ground, as destiny hung by a thread of steel and faith. The storm's roar matched the fury in Thomas's heart as he faced Edward in the courtyard. Edward snarled, "You were always too weak to lead." Thomas raised his sword, voice breaking yet firm. "Strength without honor is nothing." Lightning split the sky, casting their shadows long across blood-soaked stone. William hid behind a column, whispering, "Please end this." Richard watched with cold interest, his hands folded, as if history itself bent to his command. The prisoner shouted through rattling chains, "Strike not for power but for truth." Steel met steel, sparks leaping into the night. The clash of brothers turned enemies, sealing the kingdom's fate. The battle within the battle raged as Edward pressed forward, his strikes vicious and relentless. "You cannot stop me," he hissed, his blade slashing sparks. Thomas stumbled but countered, his voice steady. "I fight not for myself but for those betrayed." William gripped the parchment tighter, whispering prayers into the storm. Richard leaned forward from above, his cold eyes savoring every blow. The prisoner pulled against his chains, shouting, "The kingdom bleeds while you quarrel." Soldiers circled, whispers rising as their faith fractured. Thunder crashed overhead as Thomas blocked another strike, his resolve hardening in fire and rain. As Thomas's strength faltered, William stepped forward, his voice cutting through the storm. "Edward is the betrayer, not Thomas." Soldiers stirred, eyes widening, their loyalty shaken. Edward screamed, "Do not listen to the boy," his strikes wild with fury. Richard's lips curved slightly, his silence feeding the fire. Thomas caught Edward's blade, shoving him back, saying, "Your lies end tonight." William's tears mixed with rain, his small figure standing against giants. The prisoner roared from his chains, "Courage is born in the innocent." Thunder rolled as soldiers murmured louder, doubt cracking their obedience like shattered glass. The shadow figure appeared from the storm's darkness, stepping into the courtyard with commanding silence. His voice rang out, "Edward's betrayal is written in blood." Gasps spread among soldiers as Richard's expression hardened. Edward's rage broke into desperation, shouting, "I did what was needed." Thomas advanced slowly, blade steady, whispering, "No, you did what was easy." William clung to hope, whispering, "Now it ends." The prisoner lifted his face, eyes shining. Truth walks in shadows, but stands in light. Lightning revealed every face, carved by fear, courage, or ambition. The kingdom's soul hung trembling in the air. The storm reached its climax as Thomas and Edward clashed one final time. Steel screamed against steel, sparks showering like falling stars. Edward cried, "History will remember me as king," his voice breaking. Thomas drove forward, his breath fierce. History remembers truth, not tyranny. William screamed Thomas's name, fear and hope colliding in his cry. Richard stepped back into shadows, watching as destinies collided. The prisoner shouted, "Strike for justice, not vengeance." Soldiers held their breath as Edward faltered, his eyes wide with fear. Lightning split the sky as Thomas struck, the moment burning itself into eternity. The courtyard lay in silence after the storm, the ground scarred with blood and rain. Edward's body slumped in the mud, his defiance extinguished. Thomas stood trembling, his sword lowered, whispering, "No victory lives in this." William ran to him, voice quivering, "You ended it, but at what cost?" Richard watched with unreadable eyes, retreating further into shadows, his schemes shifting silently. The prisoner lifted his chains with weary strength, whispering, "Truth survives though the world bleeds." Soldiers removed helmets, their faces pale, unsure if they had witnessed justice or ruin. The fortress groaned in the wind, history now etched into its walls forever. Thomas knelt in the mud, his breath shallow, his hands trembling over Edward's still form. "You were my brother once," he whispered, tears streaking his dirt-stained face. William placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Do not carry his sins as your own." Richard turned away, his cloak trailing like smoke, his silence more dangerous than words. The prisoner's gaze softened, murmuring, "Mercy lives even in grief." Soldiers stood uncertain, shifting uneasily between broken loyalty and faint hope. The storm had passed, yet its echoes lingered like wounds too deep to heal. Above them the sun fought to pierce through the veil of gray. In the war-torn hall, Richard spoke to the council, his tone sharp and cold. "The kingdom must remember strength, not sentiment," he declared. Thomas entered slowly, his face scarred by grief but hardened by truth. "Strength without justice devours itself," he said firmly. William followed, clutching the parchment like a torch of defiance. The prisoner, now brought forth still in chains, raised his voice. "The heir lives, though the crown is soaked in blood." Nobles whispered, fear and doubt echoing against the stone. Richard's glare promised storms yet to come. For a moment, the council trembled on the edge of collapse. That night, William carried a candle into the prisoner's cell, his voice soft. "Will you take the crown?" The prisoner smiled faintly, saying, "The crown is but a weight. Justice is the true burden." Thomas leaned against the wall, his face shadowed, whispering, "I cannot undo what I've done, but I can protect what remains." Richard lingered outside the chamber, his expression unreadable, a storm hidden in silence. William's eyes welled with tears, whispering, "Then, let us end the cycle." The candle flame wavered as if uncertain of survival, shadows painting the walls with fragile hope. At dawn, the courtyard stood silent, the storm washed clean but not forgiven. Thomas walked away alone, cloak torn, his footsteps echoing against stone. William placed the parchment upon Edward's grave, whispering, "History will know the truth." The prisoner raised his head toward the rising sun, chains glinting like broken promises. Richard's figure disappeared into mist, his silence heavier than thunder. Soldiers bowed their heads, mourning both victory and loss. The air carried the scent of wet earth and blood, but also the faintest hope. The kingdom's story ended not with triumph, but with sacrifice carved into memory.